My name is Elena Hale. I am 31 years old, and I was raised from the cradle to hate a family I had never spoken a word to. Not dislike, hate. It was the first inheritance handed to me, before the vineyard, before the house, before anything. Before I could read, I knew the name Crane, the way you know the name of a disease, something to be feared and kept off your land. And I never once questioned it, because when your whole family agrees on a thing your entire life, it stops looking like an opinion and starts looking like the weather. I am telling you this story because of what happened when I fell in love with the enemy, and because of what I found in a locked filing cabinet that turned 30 years of hatred inside out in a single afternoon. If you have ever been handed a grudge by your family and told to carry it without asking why, if you have ever hated something on someone else's say-so, then I need you to stay with me all the way to the end, because I learned the hard way what those inherited hatreds actually cost and who they actually protect. But before I start, if you are new here, take a second to subscribe, because these are the stories I make for people untangling something old and knotted, and I would love to have you along. And leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight, and whether there is an old family grudge in your history that nobody can quite explain the origin of anymore. I have a feeling there are more of those out there than anyone admits. Now let me take you back. I grew up on Hale Vineyards in the Alder Valley, a long green fold of California wine country where my family has grown grapes for 4 generations. If you have ever driven through wine country and seen those endless rows of vines rolling up the hills in the golden light, you have seen the kind of place I mean, and you have probably thought, as everyone does, that it looks like paradise, and it is beautiful. But a family business rooted that deep in one patch of earth is also a kind of trap, and the thing that had us most tightly trapped, more than the debt, more than the weather, more than the brutal work of it, was the feud. For 30 years, the Hales had been at war with the Cranes. Crane cellars sat on the next ridge over, close enough that from our highest vineyard, you could look across the little valley and see their vines climbing their hills the same way ours climbed ours. 2 families growing the same grapes in the same sun a mile apart, and hating each other with a completeness that had become the defining fact of both our lives. I did not know the details as a child. I just knew the rules. We did not speak to Cranes. We did not sell to anyone who sold to Cranes. At the county fair, at the harvest festivals, at church, if a Crane came into a room, a Hale left it. My father, Robert Hale, could not say the name without his jaw going tight. And the story, the little that I knew of it, was this. 30 years ago, my grandfather Samuel Hale and old Henry Crane had been partners, friends even, and there had been a piece of land, the Ridgeline parcel, the best growing ground in the whole valley, and Henry Crane had cheated my grandfather out of it, stolen it through some legal trick, some betrayal of a handshake deal. That parcel, that stolen ground, was now the crown jewel of Crane cellars, and every bottle they sold off it was, in my family's telling, a bottle of stolen wine. That was the wound. That was the thing we had all agreed to hate about for 3 decades. I believed it completely. Why would I not? My grandfather was a hero in our house, a hard-working, honest man cheated by a snake. And I had been raised on the story the way other children are raised on fairy tales. I hated Henry Crane, who was dead, and I hated his son, Thomas Crane, who ran the winery now. And by extension, I hated the whole Crane bloodline, sight unseen, on principle. I want you to understand how thoroughly a child absorbs a thing like this, because it matters for the rest of the story. I was not taught to hate the Cranes in any single lesson. It came in through 1,000 small doors. It was in the way my father's voice dropped when their name came up. It was in the fact that when I was 9 and made friends with a Crane cousin at a 4-H meeting, Not even knowing who she was, my father made me end the friendship and would not explain why beyond, "We do not associate with those people." It was in the toast my grandfather gave every harvest, every single year, raising his glass and saying, "To the land they could not steal," and everyone at the table murmuring it back like a prayer. By the time I was old enough to ask questions, hating the cranes was not a belief I held. It was a fact about the shape of the world, like gravity, like the seasons. Nobody argues with gravity. I grew up certain that somewhere across that little valley lived a family of thieves, and that certainty was as much a part of me as my own name. And then, at 31 years old, at a water rights hearing of all places, I met Julian Crane. I have to explain the water thing, because it is the only reason a Hale and a Crane were ever in the same room long enough to speak. The Alder Valley had been in a drought for 3 years, and the county had called all the vineyard owners together to hammer out an emergency agreement about the shared aquifer we all drew from. Because if we did not agree to share, we would all pump the ground dry, and everyone would lose everything. So there we all were, 40 rival winemakers in a stuffy county building. And I was there representing Hale Vineyards because my father refused to sit in a room with a Crane. And across the aisle, representing Crane sellers for the same reason in reverse, was Julian. I knew who he was the second he walked in. You always know your enemy. He was in his early 30s, tall, with dark hair and an easy way of standing that I immediately resented. And when the meeting turned into the shouting match everyone knew it would, when 40 desperate families started tearing at each other over water, Julian Crane stood up and said the thing that made me look at him twice. He said, "We can fight over the water until every vine in this valley is dead, and then we will all have been right, and we will all be ruined. Or we can act like the water belongs to the valley instead of to any one of us." He got shouted down, of course, but he was right, and I knew he was right. And I hated that the smartest, most decent thing said in that whole ugly room had come out of the mouth of a Crane. What made it worse was what happened after. When the meeting broke up in the usual chaos, I was gathering my papers, furious, and Julian walked past my chair, and our eyes met, and I braced myself for a sneer, for the arrogance of a thief's grandson, for something I could file away as proof that everything I had been taught was true. And instead he just nodded at me, polite, tired, one exhausted vineyard kid to another, and he said, "Your Zinfandel block on the north slope. I can see it from my kitchen. It is the most beautiful piece of ground in this valley, and if we all keep pumping, it will be the first to go. Take care of it." And then he was gone, and I stood there holding my papers, completely undone, because the enemy had just paid the most loving compliment anyone had ever paid to the land I would die for. Nothing about that fit the story. And when the story does not fit, you have 2 choices. You can look away, or you can start pulling the thread. God help me, I started pulling the thread. If you have ever had your entire worldview inconvenienced by the enemy turning out to be reasonable, tell me in the comments. It is one of the most disorienting things that can happen to a person, and it happened to me in a folding chair in a county building, and nothing was ever the same after. We ended up on the same committee. The county, in its wisdom, put together a small working group to draft the water sharing plan, and by pure alphabetical cruelty, or fate, it was mostly Hale and Crane. So for the better part of that spring, once a week, I sat across a table from Julian Crane and worked with him on a plan to save the valley, and I want to tell you how it went, because it did not go the way 30 years of hatred had prepared me for. It went well. That was the problem. Julian was thoughtful and funny, and he actually listened, which is rarer in a man than anyone admits. And he knew the land the way I knew the land, loved it the way I loved it. worried about it the way I worried about it. We were, it turned out, the same person raised on opposite ridges. We both got up before dawn to walk the rows. We both talked to the vines, which we both pretended we did not do. We had both come home to take over from difficult fathers, and we both felt the crushing weight of being the generation that might be the one to lose what 4 generations had built. Every single thing that was supposed to make us enemies, we had in common. Let me tell you about a few of those Wednesdays, because the whole thing turned on them. There was the afternoon we argued for 2 hours about well depths, and then discovered we had both brought the exact same terrible gas station coffee because it was the only thing open at 5 in the morning, and we laughed so hard the county clerk came in to see what was wrong. There was the day I mentioned, without thinking, that our oldest vines, the ones my great-grandfather planted, were struggling. And the next Wednesday, Julian slid a piece of paper across the table, a soil amendment his family had used on their oldest block with the same problem. 30 years of Crane Vineyard knowledge handed to a Hale like it was nothing, like we were not supposed to be enemies, like the vines mattered more than the war. There was the evening we both stayed late and got to talking, really talking. And he told me about coming home from college to find his father sick and the winery failing, about the weight of it, about the nights he lay awake certain he was going to be the Crane who lost Crane Cellars. And I sat there stunned, because he was describing my exact life, my exact fear, in my exact words. And I had been raised to believe there was nothing on that ridge but thieves. I started looking forward to Wednesdays. I am not proud of how fast it happened, but I promised you the truth. Somewhere in those weeks of arguing about acre feet and well depths, I stopped seeing a crane across the table and started seeing Julian. And the day I realized I had done that, I felt like a traitor to my whole family, to my grandfather's memory, to the story I had been raised on. Because how could I? How could I feel my heart lift when a crane walked into the room? It was the water hearing all over again. The enemy kept refusing to be the villain, and it was breaking something open in me that I did not know how to close back up. There was a saying my grandmother had. Alice Hale, my father's mother, was the only person in my family who never seemed to fully sign on to the war, though she never said so out loud while my grandfather was alive. When I was a girl, and I would repeat some hateful thing about the cranes that I had picked up at the dinner table, my grandmother would get a tired look, and she would say, "A grudge is the only crop that grows without tending, Eleanor. Everything good in this life you have to water and prune and protect. But a grudge just grows, all on its own, in the dark, and it poisons the soil around it." I did not know what she meant when I was young. I thought I understood it that spring, working beside Julian. I did not fully understand it until later, when I found out what my grandmother had known all along and never said. The thing between Julian and me came to a head at the end of the summer. We finished the water plan, and it was good, and it saved the valley. And on the last night of the committee, we stayed late in the empty county building, signing the final papers. And when it was done, and there was no more reason to ever see each other again, we sat in the parking lot, and neither of us left. We sat on the tailgate of my truck in the dark, and there was this unbearable weight to it, the knowledge that the reason we had been allowed to see each other every week was gone now. That tomorrow we went back to being a Hale and a Crane on opposite ridges, enemies by birth, and that the most alive I had felt in years was about to be over. Neither of us wanted to be the one to leave. We talked about nothing, stretching it out, and then we ran out of nothing. And there was just the silence and the crickets and the impossible thing sitting between us that neither of us was allowed to say. And Julian said, quietly, "I know exactly what you are, and I know exactly what I am, and I know how this valley works. but I have not been able to think about anything but you since the first meeting, and I would rather say it out loud and be wrong than let you drive away thinking I did not. And I should have said it was impossible. I should have started my truck and driven home to Hale Vineyards and never looked back. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the harvest toast. I thought about my father's face if he could see me. And then I looked at this man who loved the same dirt I loved, who had been handed the same war I had been handed, and I said, some things don't listen to what's impossible. And that was the beginning of the most secret, most terrifying, most alive 6 months of my life. We hid it at first because we had to. Do you understand what we were risking? It was not just disapproval. Both our fathers had built their entire identities on this hatred. My father would have seen it as a betrayal of his own father's memory, as spitting on the grave of the man Henry Crane cheated. We met in the one place no Hale or Crane would ever look, the neutral ground of the valley itself, out in the far vineyards at dusk, down by the creek that marked the old boundary line, in the little tasting rooms of wineries owned by neither of our families. We fell completely, recklessly in love, and every day of it I carried a stone of guilt in my stomach because I was betraying my family, my grandfather, 30 years of righteous anger for a Crane. And yet, I have never felt so much like myself as I did in those stolen months. That is the strange, terrible thing about it. The secret was agony. But the person I was inside the secret was the truest version of me I had ever been. Julian and I would meet at the creek after dark, park our trucks on opposite banks so no one would see them together, and walk the old boundary line in the moonlight, 1 foot on Hale land and 1 foot on Crane land, laughing about how the whole valley would faint if they could see us. He brought me a bottle of Crane wine once, the wine I had been raised to think of as poison, stolen wine, and I drank it by the creek, and it was extraordinary, and I cried, because it was so good, and because I had been taught to hate it, and because everything I had been taught was starting to feel like a wall I was climbing over into a much bigger world. We talked about impossible things. We talked about what it would be like to not hide. We never once said the word marriage, because it was so far past impossible that saying it out loud would have felt cruel to both of us. We just loved each other in the dark, on the boundary line, and hoped the sun would never come up. But secrets in a valley that small do not keep forever, and I knew, we both knew, that eventually something would have to break. We had one terrible near miss that autumn that I still think about. We had gotten careless, met too early, before full dark, at a tasting room 2 towns over that we thought was safe, and halfway through a glass of wine, I looked up and saw, 3 tables away, my father's oldest friend and business partner, a man who had been at every Hale harvest for 40 years. My blood turned to ice. If he saw me, sitting close with a man, laughing, and if he recognized Julian Crane, it would be back to my father before I got home. I do not remember what excuse I made. I remember gripping Julian's hand under the table hard enough to hurt, and I remember the long, sick walk to the door with my face turned away. And I remember sitting in my truck in the dark parking lot afterward, shaking, and realizing that I was living a double life that could detonate at any second, and that I was going to have to make a choice eventually between the family that raised me and the man I loved, and that there might not be a version of the story where I got to keep both. That night, I almost ended it. I almost decided that it was too much, too dangerous, too disloyal, and that I should go back to being a good Hale and marry someone my father approved of and forget I had ever climbed over the wall. I sat in that truck for an hour, and then Julian texted me a photograph he had taken earlier of the 2 of us, blurry, both of us laughing, and I looked at it, and I knew I could not go back to the small, cold life on the other side of that fence. Not now that I had seen what was over here. I just did not know that the thing that broke would be the entire foundation of my family's story. And then, that winter, I found out that the anger was not righteous at all. I want to pause here, because this is the part that changed everything. And I know some of you have felt the ground shift under a family story you thought was solid. If this is landing on you tonight, subscribe and stay with me and share this with someone who is carrying a hatred they never got to choose. Here is what I found. It happened because of the drought. In the end, the same thing that brought Julian and me together. My father, facing another dry year and mounting debt, decided we had to refinance the vineyard. And that meant pulling every old document, every deed, every contract out of the ancient locked filing cabinets in the back office that no one had opened in years. He was too proud and too busy to do it himself, so he sent me. And so I spent 3 days in that dusty back office, going through 30 and 40-year-old paperwork, the entire legal history of Hale Vineyards. And that is how I found the file on the Ridgeline parcel, the stolen land, the wound at the center of my whole family's identity. Except it had not been stolen. I sat on the floor of that back office and I read the entire file, the original contracts, the letters, the bank records, all of it. And the story they told was nothing like the story I had been raised on. The Ridgeline parcel had not been taken from my grandfather by Henry Crane. My grandfather, Samuel Hale, the hero of my childhood, had lost it. He had made a series of bad bets, borrowed against the parcel, gotten in over his head during a downturn, and when the bank was about to take it, Henry Crane, his partner and his friend, had bought the loan to keep it in local hands and offered to hold the parcel until Samuel could buy it back. It was all there in Henry Crane's own handwriting, letter after letter, an old friend trying to save a proud man from himself. I read those letters 3 times, sitting on that dusty floor, because my mind kept refusing them. Everything in me had been built on the opposite story, and the mind does not surrender a foundation easily. It looks for any escape, any way the documents could mean something else. But there was no other way to read them. The dates lined up, the bank records lined up. The handwriting was Henry Crane's, and it was not the handwriting of a thief. It was the handwriting of a man trying, gently and privately, to save his friend's dignity while he saved his friend's land. I found the promissory note. I found the offer to sell the parcel back at the exact price Henry had paid. No profit, no interest, just holding it for a friend. And I found, worst of all, the record that my grandfather never took him up on it. Not because Henry withdrew the offer, but because Samuel Hale never had the money and could not bear to admit it. And Samuel Hale never bought it back, because he could not, because the money was gone. And rather than admit to his family and his valley that he had gambled away the best land in the Alder Valley, my grandfather did something unforgivable. He told everyone that Henry Crane had stolen it. He took his own failure, his own shame, and he painted it onto the face of the friend who had tried to help him. And he built a 30-year war to cover a lie, and he died with that war still burning. And he handed it down to my father, who handed it down to me. Henry Crane never defended himself. That was the part that undid me. There was one last letter from Henry to Samuel, dated years after the parcel was lost, and in it, Henry wrote, "You can tell the valley whatever you need to tell them, Sam. I know what really happened, and so do you, and I am not going to shame an old friend in front of his family to save my own name. But I hope someday you will stop needing me to be the villain of your story. It is a heavy thing to hate a man for a crime he did not commit. Henry Crane took the blame for 30 years, let 2 families be poisoned, let his own son inherit the hatred, all to protect the pride of a friend who had betrayed him, and my grandfather let him. Everything I had hated my whole life. was a lie built to protect a man's ego. My grandmother's words came back to me on that dusty floor. A grudge is the only crop that grows without tending, and it poisons the soil. She had known. I was sure of it, sitting there. She had known the whole time, and she had been too loyal to her husband to say it out loud, and she had watched the poison spread down through the generations and could only warn me in riddles. I did not know what to do. I sat with it for a week, sick to my stomach, and then I did the only thing that felt honest. I took the file to Julian. I put 30 years of my family's biggest lie into the hands of the enemy I loved, and I watched him read it by the creek in the last light, and I watched his face as he understood that his grandfather, the man his whole family had believed was hated unfairly but had never known why, had been a hero. That Henry Crane had eaten 30 years of a whole valley's contempt to protect a friend who did not deserve it. Because here is the thing I had not fully grasped until I watched Julian read those letters. The lie had not only poisoned the Hales, it had poisoned the Cranes just as deeply, in a different way. Julian's family had spent 30 years being hated by the whole valley and never understanding why, being called thieves at every festival and every fair, watching doors close, all without ever knowing what crime they were supposed to have committed, because there was no crime. Imagine that. Imagine your family carrying the label of thief for 3 decades for something that never happened, and never even being told the accusation clearly enough to deny it. Julian had grown up feeling the valley's coldness and assuming his family must have done something to deserve it. And now, by the creek, he was learning that they had done nothing at all except try to help a friend, and that the friend had repaid them by making them the villain of a story the whole valley believed. Julian cried. This grown man read those letters by the creek and cried for a grandfather he suddenly understood for the first time, and I held him, a Hale holding a Crane on the old boundary line, and I understood that the two of us, right there, were the first good thing to grow out of that poisoned soil in 3 decades. Here is how it came out, because I know you need to know. I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I took the file to my father. I sat Robert Hale down at the same dinner table where he had taught me to hate, and I made him read his own father's lie in his own father's handwriting, and I watched a 60-year-old man's entire understanding of himself come apart. Because everything he was, all his righteous anger, his identity as the wronged party, the very thing that had organized his whole life, was built on a foundation of his father's shame. I will never forget his face as he read. First the irritation, the certainty that I had gotten something wrong. Then the slow stillness as the documents refused to say what he needed them to say. Then something I had never seen on my father's face in my entire life, which was doubt, and then, worst of all, understanding. When he finished, he did not yell. He set the letters down very carefully, and he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, in a voice I did not recognize, "My whole life." And I understood that in those 2 words was everything. Every harvest toast, every friendship he had forbidden, every year he had spent as the angry, wronged son of a cheated man, when in truth he was the son of the cheat. He had inherited a role, and he had played it with his whole heart for 60 years. And I had just told him the play was a lie. He did not take it well at first. People rarely do when you take away the enemy that has been holding them together. He was angry at me, angry at the letters, angry at his dead father, and he did not speak to me for 2 weeks. He needed those 2 weeks. He needed to rage at me for being the one who found it, and then rage at his father for being the one who did it. And then, slowly, sit in the terrible quiet that is left when the enemy you have organized your life around turns out to have been your own family all along. But my father is not, underneath it all, a dishonest man. He was just a man who had inherited a lie and never thought to question it, the same as me. And eventually, the truth did what the truth does. It wore him down to honesty. The reconciliation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen like a movie, but it happened. My father drove over to Crane Cellars, alone, one morning that spring, the first Hale to set foot on that land in 30 years, and he sat down with Thomas Crane, and he told him the truth about the Ridgeline parcel, and he apologized on behalf of his father for 30 years of a lie. I only know the outline of what passed between them, because some things are private, but I know it took courage that I am not sure I will ever match. Think about what my father carried up that Crane driveway. Not just an apology, a demolition of his own family's honor, delivered by hand to the family they had wronged. He had to sit in Thomas Crane's kitchen and say, out loud, my father lied. My father ruined your family's name to save his own. My father let you be called a thief for 30 years, and I believed him, and I carried it on, and I taught it to my daughter, and I am sorry. There is no harder sentence in the English language than an honest apology for a wrong you spent your life committing in good faith. My father said it anyway. I have never been prouder of him. Thomas Crane told Julian later that when my father finished talking, the two of them, sworn enemies for 3 decades, sat in the Crane kitchen and cried like boys for all the wasted years, for the friendship their fathers had thrown away, for the whole stupid, poisoned inheritance that neither of them had chosen and both of them had carried. And then, Thomas said, my father asked if it was too late for the two of them to be friends at 60-some years old, and Thomas said no, it was not too late, and they have been nearly inseparable ever since. 2 old men making up for 30 stolen years, playing cards on Thursdays, arguing about grapes, laughing. Julian and I were married the following autumn at harvest in the Vineyard, with both families there. Both families. Hales and Cranes, in the same rows of vines for the first time in 30 years, drinking each other's wine, weeping and laughing. An entire valley exhaling a breath it had been holding since before I was born. If you have stayed with me this far, thank you, and I hope you will subscribe and share this with someone who is standing on one side of a fence they never chose to build. Because I want to tell you what that wedding actually felt like, and I want you to hold it, in case you ever need it. It felt like a spell breaking. There were people at that wedding who had not spoken to each other in 3 decades, who had crossed the street to avoid each other, who had taught their children to hate, and there they were. An old Crane aunt and an old Hale uncle who had gone to school together 60 years ago before the feud, holding hands and sobbing, given back a friendship they had lost to a lie when they were young. 30 years of wasted evenings. 30 years of empty chairs at tables that should have been full. All of it because one proud man could not admit he had failed. And all of it undone in one afternoon under the vines because 2 of us had refused to inherit it. My grandmother, Alice, lived just long enough to see it. She was 90, and she held my hand at the wedding, and she looked out at the 2 families mingled together under the vines. And she leaned over to me, and she said, very quietly, so only I could hear, "You pulled up the grudge by the roots, Elena. Your grandfather planted it, and I watered it with my silence, God forgive me, and you are the one who finally pulled it up. Then go plant something better in that soil." She died that winter. I think she had been waiting. I think she had held on through 30 years of a lie she was too loyal to expose, waiting for someone with the courage to do what she could not. And once she saw it done, she let go. We did plant something better. Julian and I merged the two wineries, the year after we married, into one label, and we called it after nothing and no one, just a name for the valley itself, because we were done with the war of the names. The ridgeline parcel, the stolen ground that was never stolen, is the heart of our vineyard now, and the wine that comes off it is the best we make, and we do not call it stolen anything. We call it a reconciliation, and we pour it for free at the Harvest Festival every year to anyone in the valley who wants a glass. We put a little plaque out on the ridgeline block at Julian's suggestion, and I think about it every time I walk those rows. It does not tell the whole ugly story. It just has two names on it, Samuel Hale and Henry Crane, and underneath the word partners and the years they worked that ground together before the lie. Julian said we should honor the truth, which was that before it all went wrong, before the shame and the lie and the 30 years, there had been two friends who loved the same land and built something together. That was the real thing. The feud was the counterfeit, and it felt right, standing out there, to let the last word on that ground be the friendship and not the war. My father walks that block sometimes now, with Thomas Crane, the two of them arguing about irrigation like the old friends they have finally allowed themselves to become. I watch them from the house, two grey-haired men who lost 30 years to a lie, walking the rows together in the evening light. And I think about my grandmother, and I think we got some of it back, not all of it. You never get all of it back, but some. So here is what a locked filing cabinet and a 30-year lie taught me, and it is what I want to leave with you tonight. Be very careful about the hatreds you inherit. Somebody handed them to you, and somebody had a reason, and the reason is very often not the one you were told. The grudges we carry the longest are frequently the ones built to protect somebody's shame, and we spend our whole lives being loyal soldiers in a war that was started to cover a lie. Think about how much it costs. Two families lost 30 years. Two old men who should have been lifelong friends lost the best decades of their friendship. A whole valley organized itself around an enmity that protected exactly one person, a man who had been dead for years, from an embarrassment he was too proud to face while he was alive. Everyone else paid and paid and paid, so that one man's pride would never have to. That is what an inherited hatred almost always is when you finally dig it up by the roots. It is somebody's old shame, still collecting interest, generations later, from people who never even knew the man it was meant to protect. If your family has taught you to hate something or someone without ever quite being able to explain why, I want you to consider pulling up that crop by the roots and looking at what is tangled around them. You might find, like I did, that the enemy was never the enemy. You might find that the war was never yours. You might find something worth loving on the other side of a fence that never should have been built. It is not disloyal to question a grudge. Sometimes questioning it is the most loyal thing you can do, because it is the only way to stop the poison before it reaches the next generation. I stopped it at me. My children will grow up drinking wine with Cranes, and they will not understand why that was ever remarkable, and that, to me, is the whole point. That is my story. A stolen parcel that was never stolen, a hero who was a liar, a villain who was a hero, and a Hale and a Crane who fell in love across 30 years of poisoned ground and pulled the whole grudge up by the roots. If someone came to mind while you listened, some grudge in your own family whose origin nobody can quite remember, tell me about it in the comments. Share this with the person on the other side of your fence. Hit subscribe and stay with me, because there are more of these to come, and I am so grateful you are here. I will see you in the next one.